Ilhan Omar entered that hearing room expecting to overwhelm John Kennedy. Instead, the Louisiana senator opened a folder, lowered his voice, and turned the entire proceeding into the most consequential confrontation of her political career. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spent much of my life around politics, cameras, committee rooms, and televised confrontations. I have watched hearings that genuinely changed the direction of government, and I have watched many more that produced little beyond carefully rehearsed speeches and temporary headlines. I have seen senators perform for the cameras, representatives deliver emotional monologues, witnesses avoid direct questions, and committee chairs strike their gavels as though noise alone could create order. But the confrontation described in this account was unlike the ordinary political theater Washington produces every week. It began as an attempted public humiliation and developed into a systematic presentation of accusations, financial records, emails, recordings, and sworn statements. John Kennedy did not shout. He did not rush. He did not try to overpower Ilhan Omar with volume. He allowed the material in his folder to shape the confrontation. One document and one question at a time. Omar opened aggressively. Standing in the crowded hearing room, she pointed toward Kennedy and accused him of representing the most shameful parts of America's past. She described him as the symbol of an old political order built on prejudice toward immigrants and Muslims. Her voice carried across the House Foreign Affairs Committee chamber, where she had been granted special questioning privileges during what had originally been presented as a routine hearing on refugee resettlement policy. However, Omar did not appear interested in discussing policy details. She had entered the room prepared for a personal confrontation. She attacked Kennedy's background, his clothing, his Louisiana accent, and what she portrayed as his inability to understand the lives of refugees. She accused him of pretending to care about human rights while building a career in excluding people like her from the American dream. The gallery reacted exactly as she had anticipated. Progressive activists who had arrived early applauded loudly. Some wore hijabs as an expression of solidarity. Others held signs welcoming refugees and declaring that no human being should be considered illegal. Reporters filled the media section, and from where I sat, many of them appeared prepared for a familiar story. Ilhan Omar confronts an older conservative senator, forces him onto the defensive, and leaves the room with the most memorable lines of the day. Kennedy, however, remained seated. While Omar continued, he wrote notes on a legal pad. He showed no visible anger and made no attempt to interrupt her. The only indication that he might have been preparing something unexpected was the slight movement at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who seemed to know that the confrontation was moving exactly where he wanted it to go. Omar continued by saying that Kennedy had never experienced persecution, exile, refugee camps, or the struggle of rebuilding a life in a foreign country. She asked what qualified him to judge policies affecting vulnerable people. Then she paused and waited for the applause. The applause came. The tactic was familiar. Make the confrontation personal. Shift attention from the policy question to identity. Force the opponent to defend his character, background, and motives. Transform the person asking questions into the person being questioned. It had worked before because many politicians entered confrontations prepared with speeches but not evidence. On this occasion, Kennedy had brought a manila folder. When Omar completed her remarks, Kennedy looked up and thanked her for what he called a passionate statement about struggle and persecution. His language remained polite, and his Louisiana drawl made each sentence sound conversational rather than confrontational. Then he said that since Omar had raised the importance of personal experience, perhaps the committee should examine her experiences more thoroughly. He opened the folder. The atmosphere changed immediately. The committee room had been filled with whispers, movements, and quiet conversations. Once the folder opened, the room became still. What caught my attention was not Kennedy's expression, but Omar's. For a fraction of a second, her confidence appeared to weaken. She could not yet have known precisely what Kennedy intended to present, but she seemed to understand that the discussion was no longer going to remain a general argument over immigration policy. Kennedy began with Omar's personal history, specifically her 2009 legal marriage to Ahmed Nur Said Elmi. He stated that questions had long circulated about whether Elmi was her brother. Omar rejected the claim immediately, calling it a false and offensive conspiracy theory. Her supporters in the gallery began shouting accusations of prejudice and Islamophobia. Reporters started typing rapidly, and several Democratic committee members looked uncertain about where the questioning was heading. Kennedy did not argue with the interruption. He produced records that he said came from educational institutions in the United Kingdom. According to his presentation, those documents listed a paternal name similar to one contained in Omar's refugee records. He then referred to affidavits from members of the Somali community in Minneapolis who allegedly described Elmi as a member of Omar's family. Kennedy next said that records showed Omar, Elmi, and Ahmed Hirsi, the man she had married in a religious ceremony and with whom she had children, residing at the same address in Columbia Heights, Minnesota. The room became quieter. Kennedy remarked that it was unusual for a woman to live with both the man recognized as her cultural husband and the man recorded as her legal husband, particularly when allegations suggested that the legal husband might also be her brother. He then raised questions concerning tax filings, saying Omar had filed joint returns with Hirsi while remaining legally married to Elmi. His method was deliberate. He did not present the entire accusation at once. He established the timeline through a sequence of questions. He asked Omar to confirm that she had entered an Islamic faith marriage with Hirsi in 2002. She acknowledged that they had held a religious ceremony. Kennedy asked whether they had 2 children during that period. She confirmed that they had. He asked whether they separated in 2008 without completing a legal divorce because they had never been legally married. Again, she agreed. He then moved to 2009 when she legally married Elmi and filed the marriage with the state of Minnesota. Omar tried to say that she had explained the matter before, but Kennedy insisted on establishing each fact first. From a political and legal perspective, the strategy was clear. He was not asking questions because he lacked the answers. He was placing each element of the timeline into the official record and encouraging Omar to confirm it personally. Kennedy displayed what he described as lease agreements, utility bills, and voter registrations indicating that Omar, Hirsi, and Elmi had lived at the same residence during the legal marriage. He then discussed Elmi's student status at North Dakota State University. Kennedy alleged that Omar's position as his legal spouse had helped Elmi qualify for educational and immigration benefits that allowed him to remain in the United States. When Omar described the material as circumstantial, Kennedy introduced social media screenshots. One of those posts, he said, showed Elmi referring to Omar's daughter as his niece rather than his stepdaughter. Kennedy then returned to the family records. He compared a paternal name from Elmi's British school documents with a similar name listed in Omar's refugee application. Omar responded that names were frequently altered during refugee resettlement, a circumstance Kennedy acknowledged. He followed with affidavits from 6 members of the Minneapolis Somali community. According to Kennedy, each person had sworn under penalty of perjury that Elmi was Omar's brother. One woman claimed to have known the family in Somalia before they fled. The hearing room had now taken on the character of a courtroom. The applause and shouting had disappeared. Every movement seemed louder. A pen clicking, a chair shifting, a nervous cough. Kennedy then presented what he called the most significant evidence in that portion of the hearing, an email exchange allegedly recovered through a public records request. He read a message attributed to Elmi thanking Omar for helping him obtain immigration papers and addressing her as sister. Kennedy then read the alleged response, in which Omar said that family members helped each other and advised him to delete the emails. Omar called the exchange fabricated. Kennedy replied by asking whether she was accusing the State Department of fabrication because he said the emails had been retrieved from official government servers, dated, authenticated, and produced through the Freedom of Information Act. At that point, the effectiveness of the accusation lay not in Kennedy's volume but in his restraint. He spoke calmly, as though the source of the material should be self-explanatory. Omar had challenged the authenticity of the email, and Kennedy responded by identifying the government system from which he claimed it had come. Kennedy then moved to tax records from 2014 and 2015. He displayed returns bearing Omar's signature that he said had been filed jointly with Hirsi while she was still legally married to Elmi. Omar said those filings had already been corrected. Kennedy answered that they had been corrected only after journalists began investigating. He argued that correcting an inaccurate filing after discovery did not erase the original violation. He also alleged that the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Division had opened a review concerning benefits claimed through those joint returns. Several Democratic members stood and left the hearing room. In Washington, political support rarely collapses with a dramatic announcement. It often disappears quietly. A colleague checks a phone, removes a pin, avoids eye contact, or leaves through a side door. By then, Kennedy had not yet reached the financial allegations, but the political distance around Omar was already increasing. Kennedy said the issue went beyond the alleged marriage and tax violations. He accused Omar of responding to legitimate questions by labeling critics racist or Islamophobic. In his telling, identity had been used to prevent scrutiny that any other public official would have been expected to face. Omar's hands appeared unsteady, and an aide leaned toward her, speaking quietly. Omar then said she needed to consult her attorney. Kennedy agreed and added that the committee had not yet examined her campaign finance activities. A short recess followed. When the committee reconvened, several Democratic seats remained empty. Omar returned with 2 attorneys. The confidence she had displayed at the beginning of the hearing had largely disappeared. Kennedy, by contrast, appeared patient and composed as he opened another section of his folder. This section concerned Tim Minett and his political consulting company, the E Street Group. Kennedy cited Federal Election Commission records showing that Omar's campaign had paid Minett's company approximately $370,000 between 2018 and 2019. He then asked whether Omar had been involved in an extramarital relationship with Minett during the same period. Omar attempted to separate her personal relationships from the hearing, but Kennedy argued that personal matters became relevant when campaign money was involved. He introduced testimony from Beth Minett's divorce proceedings in the District of Columbia. According to the deposition Kennedy read, Beth Minett said her husband had told her in April 2019 that he was having an affair with Omar and traveling with her on trips paid for through the campaign. Kennedy then presented receipts he described as campaign expenditures for dinners in France, a couple's spa retreat in California, and hotel rooms in locations where no campaign events were scheduled. He asked the room to consider the source of that money. Campaign donations often come from ordinary people giving $20 or $50 because they believe they are helping a political cause. Kennedy argued that using such contributions for private travel or romantic expenses would not be ordinary politics. It would be misuse of donor money. Omar maintained that the travel had legitimate campaign purposes. Kennedy then connected his phone to the committee's audio system and played a recording attributed to Tim Minett. In it, a man could be heard telling his wife not to worry about money because Omar's campaign was paying for everything. The gallery reacted with shock, and one Omar staff member lowered her head into her hands. Kennedy continued. After Omar and Minett married in March 2020, he said, campaign payments to Minett's company did not stop, they increased. Kennedy cited records showing payments of approximately $1.1 million during 2020, making the company one of the best compensated political consulting firms in the country. He described the arrangement as a possible conversion of campaign money for personal use. Whenever Kennedy referred to himself as a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, experienced observers understood that the phrase was strategic. It lowered the temperature of his delivery while sharpening the accusation that followed. The image was modest, but the preparation behind it was extensive. Organized files, detailed timelines, public records, recordings, and questions constructed months in advance. Kennedy next discussed findings by the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board. He said Omar had previously been required to repay money after using campaign funds for personal travel and personal tax preparation. The tax-related expense, he noted, involved correcting the joint returns discussed earlier. He also alleged that campaign money had been used to pay legal fees connected to Omar's divorce from Elmi. The cumulative effect of the presentation was more important than any single number. Kennedy was connecting the marriage allegations, tax filings, campaign expenditures, and personal relationships into one continuous narrative of possible misconduct. He then shifted to a business associated with Minett, the Northside Wine Group. Kennedy asked whether Omar knew a man named Naeem Maud. A well-dressed man stood in the gallery. Kennedy said Maud had invested $300,000 in Minett's wine business after being promised a substantial return. According to Kennedy, the promised money never arrived, and Maud believed the investment had instead helped finance a $1.3 million home in Washington where Omar and Minett lived. Maud interrupted from the gallery, saying he had been shown false contracts and non-existent wine inventories. He claimed that Minett had used Omar's position as a member of Congress to make the business appear trustworthy and capable of securing government-related opportunities. Kennedy asked security to allow Maud to speak, identifying him as an alleged victim rather than a threat. He then presented Omar's 2023 financial disclosure and said it listed income from the Northside Wine Group within a range of $100,000 to $1 million. Kennedy argued that if the underlying business had misled investors, Omar's reported income could connect her to the disputed funds. One of Omar's attorneys objected, describing the accusations as unfounded. Kennedy responded with a civil complaint filed in the District of Columbia alleging fraud, breach of contract, and racketeering. He also claimed federal authorities had begun examining possible interstate wire violations. The attorney sat down. Kennedy summarized his accusations. He said campaign money had financed a private relationship, large payments had gone to a company operated by the man who later became Omar's husband, donor funds had been used for personal tax and divorce expenses, and Omar had received income from a business facing fraud allegations. Omar made one more broad defense, saying she was being targeted as a strong woman of color. For the first time, Kennedy's tone carried unmistakable anger. He replied that fraud was not a cultural practice, theft was not a religious belief, and illegal conduct did not become lawful because the accused belonged to a minority group. He said Omar's conduct, if proven, would dishonor refugees who followed the law, Muslim Americans who practiced their faith honestly, and women who achieved public office without corruption. The response struck at the defense Omar had used throughout the hearing. Kennedy was separating scrutiny of alleged conduct from prejudice toward identity. He was arguing that genuine opposition to discrimination should never require ignoring authenticated records or financial evidence. The committee was now in visible disorder. Democratic members spoke among themselves about ethics inquiries and possible calls for resignation. Omar's staff members stared at their phones. Kennedy, however, announced that another subject remained. He turned to statements Omar had made about Jewish Americans in Israel. His demeanor changed. The humor disappeared. He began with Omar's 2019 comment that support for Israel was all about the Benjamins, followed by her reference to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Omar acknowledged that she had apologized for the comment. Kennedy replied that an apology did not automatically remove the attitude represented by the language. He then produced a screenshot of another message attributed to Omar, alleging that she had written that AIPAC owned Congress and bought politicians while referring to powerful puppet masters. Kennedy described those expressions as historic anti-Semitic stereotypes involving money, secret control, and political manipulation. He next played an audio recording that he said came from a private Minnesota fundraiser. A voice identified as Omar's accused Jewish members of Congress of divided loyalties and suggested they placed Israel ahead of the United States. Omar said the recording had been removed from its context. Kennedy offered to play the full recording and said the extended remarks were even more serious, including statements about Jewish money controlling foreign policy. Two Jewish members of the committee left the room, one visibly emotional. Kennedy continued to Omar's 2021 comparison of the United States and Israel with Hamas and the Taliban in a statement concerning alleged atrocities. Omar said she had been calling for accountability. Kennedy argued that the comparison created a false moral equivalence between democratic governments and organizations known for intentionally attacking civilians. He then examined Omar's relationship with the Council on American Islamic Relations. Omar described it as a civil rights organization. Kennedy referred to evidence presented during the Holy Land Foundation case and alleged that people involved in KIR's formation had connections to Hamas-related organizations. He displayed photographs of Omar speaking at choir events and financial records showing donations to her campaign from individuals associated with the organization. Kennedy also introduced documents concerning meetings with charities that had allegedly been identified by the Treasury Department as terrorist financing fronts. He claimed that Omar had continued contact after receiving warnings from federal authorities. Next came campaign donations from individuals associated with Qatari organizations. Omar's defense was that the donations came legally from American citizens. Kennedy argued that the arrangement was hypocritical when placed beside Omar's accusations that Jewish organizations purchased political influence. He then displayed a photograph from a Palestinian refugee camp in which Omar appeared beside a man Kennedy identified as a Hamas operative. According to Kennedy, Israeli officials had objected to the meeting, while Omar had characterized their response as an attempt to silence her. Kennedy's central argument was that Omar's rhetoric went beyond criticism of Israeli government policy. He accused her of repeatedly using stereotypes about Jewish money, questioning the loyalty of Jewish Americans, accepting support from people tied to foreign organizations, and privately repeating language that she publicly promised to avoid. The gallery had become nearly silent. Kennedy then announced that the hearing was approaching Omar's most controversial statement, her description of the September 11th attacks as an occasion when some people did something. A number of September 11th family members sat in the front row wearing photographs of relatives they had lost. Kennedy acknowledged them and warned that the material would be painful. He played video from Omar's 2019 speech at a CARE event. In the clip, she said CARE had been founded after September 11th because its members recognized that some people did something, and that Muslim Americans then began losing civil liberties. Kennedy paused the video. He repeated the phrase slowly and asked how the murder of 2,977 people could be reduced to some people did something. He argued that the language made a coordinated terrorist attack sound like an ordinary event whose details were unimportant. He then introduced an earlier radio interview in which Omar had discussed American foreign policy as a cause of anger in the Middle East. Omar said she had been examining root causes. Kennedy moved to social media posts he attributed to Omar, including one that allegedly described the American response to September 11th as excessive compared with deaths from medical errors. A man in the gallery stood and said his 23-year-old daughter had died in the North Tower and should not be reduced to a statistic. Kennedy asked him gently to allow the presentation to continue so that Omar could answer the full record. The most explosive item came next. Kennedy displayed WhatsApp messages allegedly obtained and digitally authenticated from a 2019 political group chat. In those messages, Omar was accused of telling activists that America's fixation on September 11th could be politically useful. The message suggested responding to criticism by emphasizing post-attack Islamophobia and shifting public guilt from the terrorist attack toward the treatment of Muslims afterward. The committee erupted. Even Democratic members who had remained in the room objected audibly. Kennedy accused Omar of treating the grief of September 11th families not as a national tragedy, but as a political instrument. He then referred to a federal security review. According to the material he presented, Omar had described American foreign policy as the true form of terrorism and used language suggesting that the September 11th attacks were the consequence of American actions abroad. Kennedy said reviewing agents had expressed concern about her access to classified information, but political leaders had overruled their recommendation. Finally, Kennedy read a statement attributed to a respected Minneapolis imam. The imam allegedly said he had repeatedly warned Omar that her rhetoric harmed Muslim Americans, minimized terrorism, and portrayed Muslims exclusively as victims even when violence was committed in the name of Islam. Kennedy told Omar that Muslim Americans could remain faithful to Islam while loving the United States, condemning terrorism and respecting the victims of mass murder. Then for the first time during the hearing, he stood. The movement immediately changed the room. Throughout the earlier accusations and confrontations, Kennedy had remained seated, calm and patient. When he rose, everyone understood that he was approaching his conclusion. He addressed Omar directly. He reminded her that the victims of September 11th included Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and people of no religion. Muslim police officers, firefighters, and emergency workers had entered the burning buildings to save strangers. Kennedy said that refusing to identify the attackers clearly as terrorists dishonored both the dead and the Muslim Americans who had risked their lives that day. He turned toward the families. For more than 20 years, he said, they had waited for recognition, accountability, and the basic dignity of hearing their loved ones' deaths described honestly. Kennedy said the issue was no longer simply party politics. It concerned whether someone accused of minimizing terrorism, exploiting national grief, accepting support from questionable foreign interests, and expressing hostility toward Jewish colleagues should retain access to classified national security information. He then displayed a document he said had arrived from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. According to Kennedy, Omar's security clearance was being suspended pending a full review. He said the decision would prevent her from receiving classified briefings or serving effectively on committees dealing with intelligence and national security. Omar's attorneys objected, but Kennedy continued. He said the Federal Bureau of Investigation would examine the immigration, financial, and foreign organization allegations. He said tax authorities would review the disputed returns, the Federal Election Commission would examine campaign expenditures, and the House Ethics Committee would consider accusations involving conduct, rhetoric, and abuse of office. Kennedy then told Omar that her career was ending not because of her race, religion, or gender, but because of the allegations and evidence presented against her. The hearing room dissolved into chaos. Republicans called for an expulsion vote. Democrats moved toward the exits. September 11th, family members stood and applauded through tears. Omar remained in her seat, no longer angry or defiant, but motionless. Then she rose and called the hearing a modern form of McCarthyism, a political attack designed to silence a Muslim woman who challenged powerful institutions. Kennedy replied that Senator Joseph McCarthy had made accusations without sufficient evidence. In contrast, Kennedy said he had presented 127 items, including government records, emails, financial reports, audio recordings, videos, and sworn testimony. He described the proceeding not as persecution but accountability. Kennedy then read statements he said had been issued by Omar's closest progressive allies. One attributed to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez expressed shock at the allegations and said criticism of policy could not justify fraud, corruption, or anti-Semitism. Statements attributed to Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders similarly distanced their authors from Omar. Kennedy also produced private messages allegedly exchanged among members of the progressive group commonly known as the Squad. The messages suggested that some of Omar's allies had already viewed her as a political liability and were considering creating distance from her. For Omar, that may have been among the most damaging moments of the entire hearing. Public criticism from opponents was expected. Evidence that close allies had privately doubted her suggested that the political protections surrounding her had already begun to collapse before Kennedy opened his folder. The committee chairman finally restored enough order to speak. He said the allegations were serious and requested a direct response to the evidence. Omar rejected everything as fabricated and politically motivated. The chairman replied that many of the items were government documents, authenticated messages, and recorded conversations. He announced that he would support an immediate ethics investigation and recommend that the Democratic caucus consider removing Omar from her committee assignments while the inquiries continued. Representative Gerald Nadler then asked to place a statement from Jewish Democratic members of Congress into the record. The statement said they had spent years helping Omar understand why certain words and images caused pain to Jewish communities. According to the statement, repeated apologies followed by repeated offenses could no longer be explained as ignorance. The members called for her resignation. Kennedy then read a statement attributed to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, saying that Omar would have to answer the allegations and that no member of Congress stood above accountability. Omar looked around the room for support and found little. Kennedy said she had betrayed the Somali community by encouraging the public to associate refugees with extremism, betrayed Muslim Americans by using their faith as protection from scrutiny, betrayed progressive supporters by directing their donations toward personal interests, and betrayed the United States by responding to opportunity with contempt. An announcement then came through the committee's audio system ordering Omar to surrender her security credentials immediately. Capitol police officers entered the room and approached her. As she was escorted away, Omar insisted that the confrontation was not over and that she would continue fighting. Kennedy quietly answered that the political game was over and that the next question would concern which authority examined the allegations first. He gathered his documents, acknowledged the chairman, offered a respectful gesture toward the September 11th families, and left the room as calmly as he had entered it. The consequences described in this account moved rapidly after the cameras stopped broadcasting. The Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party called for Omar to resign. Representative Andre Carson, another Muslim member of Congress, issued a statement saying that the allegations damaged the reputation of Muslim Americans and weakened the struggle against genuine Islamophobia. Protesters gathered outside Omar's district office in Minneapolis. Somali Americans carried signs declaring that fraud was not part of their culture and that Omar did not speak for them. A local imam led prayers for truth and justice. Federal authorities announced reviews involving immigration, taxes, and campaign finance. The Federal Election Commission began examining payments made to Tim Mynette's businesses. Omar released a statement through her attorney denying the accusations, describing the hearing as politically motivated and refusing to resign. Her party, however, increasingly treated her as a political risk. Progressive organizations suspended her participation. Black and progressive congressional groups released statements emphasizing that identity and ideology did not excuse dishonesty. Cable news coverage was severe across the political spectrum. Conservative networks focused on Kennedy's preparation. Mainstream outlets examined Omar's political collapse. Even networks normally sympathetic to her reported the allegations as a devastating crisis. The WhatsApp message concerning September 11th produced the strongest emotional reaction. Organizations representing survivors and victims' families demanded her removal from Congress. International reactions followed, including criticism from Somali representatives and extensive coverage in Israeli media. Within hours, a Democratic primary opponent announced a new campaign, arguing that Minneapolis deserved representation free from financial scandal and hatred. Kennedy gave only one interview afterward. Sitting on his porch in Louisiana, he said he took no pleasure in watching a person destroy a career through greed, resentment, and poor judgment. He compared corruption to an infection that sometimes required painful treatment. When asked whether he had any regrets, he said his only regret was that the confrontation had not occurred sooner. He wondered how many people had been harmed financially, how many Jewish Americans had been wounded by the rhetoric, and how many Muslim Americans had been forced to answer for conduct that did not represent their faith. Asked what would come next, Kennedy said corruption did not disappear after one investigation. More oversight remained necessary. Then he looked across the Louisiana water and reflected on the central tragedy of the story. America had offered Omar refuge from war, education, opportunity, citizenship, and high office. According to the case Kennedy presented, she had repaid those opportunities with dishonesty and hostility. Yet Kennedy still believed that the institutions of the country had eventually responded. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why this confrontation matters beyond the names John Kennedy and Ilhan Omar. The real issue was not simply one senator defeating one representative in a televised exchange. It was the temporary restoration of a principle that Washington frequently claims to respect but too rarely enforces. The rules must apply equally. Identity cannot automatically erase evidence. Political loyalty cannot transform financial records into prejudice. Accusations of discrimination cannot substitute for answers to specific questions. Shouting cannot change the dates on a document. Anger cannot rewrite an email. A carefully designed public image cannot survive indefinitely when confronted with a detailed record. Kennedy succeeded in this account because he did what oversight officials are supposed to do. He investigated before speaking. He organized the chronology. He asked questions whose answers he already understood. He resisted the temptation to compete emotionally with Omar. Most importantly, he allowed the records he presented to carry the argument. For years, many Americans had heard rumors about the marriage, the campaign money, the political consulting payments, the private rhetoric, and the controversial statements concerning September 11th. Some believed the accusations, others dismissed them as partisan attacks. What had been missing was a single public setting where all the allegations could be presented in order, before cameras, on the official record, with the accused person present and able to respond. That is what Kennedy created. He did not win through volume. He did not win through insults. He won by opening a folder and proceeding one page at a time. By the end of the hearing, the woman who had entered prepared to prosecute his character was answering questions about her own. The activists who had arrived to celebrate her were leaving quietly. The colleagues who had defended her were issuing statements of separation. The attorneys seated beside her were struggling to challenge the weight of the material. The hearing that was supposed to become Kennedy's humiliation had instead become Omar's reckoning. And through it all, the senator from Louisiana never needed to raise his voice.